At the time of production, the Pacific was the most expensive miniseries ever created, with a budget of over $200 million. With Tom Hanks and Steven Spielberg involved in this miniseries, the Pacific, like Band of Brothers, is one of the most detailed World War II productions ever created. Today we're going to take a look at the armored vehicles used in this amazing production.
Second squad, fourth boat!
The first armored vehicle featured in the production is the Landing Vehicle Tracked, or LVT, often called an Amtrak, used frequently in the Pacific Theater, seeing service from Cape Gloucester to Okinawa. The LVTs here are armed with Browning 50 and 30 caliber machine guns, which the studio used two real versions of, with numerous CGI ones used in the background. The studio also had two LVT A4s, seen here destroying a Japanese pillbox during their appearance in the series at Peleliu. These are also reused in several other scenes throughout the series. The LVT-As were developed for fire support, armed with a 75mm howitzer, which was designed to complement the 75mm gun used by Sherman tanks in the Pacific. As tanks were far less prolific in the Pacific theater compared to the European. Early LTV-A4s were particularly vulnerable to infantry, as they lacked machine gun armament. Furthermore, they had an open-top turret that remained throughout the war, which was another vulnerability, particularly to mortar fire. Interestingly, at Peleliu, many LTVs were fitted with flamethrowers, but the studio may have considered this too dangerous or expensive to reproduce. The Peleliu landing scene alone cost the studio $5 million. Many people seem to ask why the troops are dumping over the sides of the Amtraks at Peleliu. This is actually an LVT-4 with a ramp at the back, so it's a fair question. The director may have been trying to represent the experience of Marines disembarking from LVT-2s, which had no ramp and were also used in Peleliu by whichever Marines were unlucky enough to be in one. Alternatively, the large Amtrak targets were reversing off the beach in haste after drop-off, and this may have been a safer method both during filming and in practice. Many people also ask why these great vehicles were not used in the Normandy landings, mostly because US Army doctrine in Europe viewed the Sherman DD, a type of amphibious Sherman, that wasn't overly successful as the answer to assaulting the heavily defended beaches of Normandy.
No armor has made it ashore! We got no DD tanks on the beach!
Though some Amtraks were used to help unload supplies after the landings in Utah Beach. Back in the Pacific, Amtraks were also designated medical vehicles, as they could quickly transport troops right to hospital ships. This interesting Amtrak scene here was actually referred to in Eugene Sledge's novel, The Old Breed, as having actually occurred.
Hold here till we load our wounded. Then you can move your ass wherever you want.
Yes, sir.
Amtraks and other armored vehicles disembarked from an LST, which stands for Landing Ship Tank. You can see two here, LST-395 and LST-449. Both were real ships that served in the Pacific. The film used a barge to unload the LVTs and filled the rest with CGI. LSTs used a ballast system similar to a submarine, which allowed for the flat-bottom ships to sit lower in the water during ocean transit, for seaworthiness purposes. Then when offloading Amtraks, the ship would pump the ballast tanks dry, raising her to simulate offloading in shallow conditions. More than 1,000 of these ships would be built during the Second World War, and could be built in an amazing 2 months at the height of their production. Next up, we have our Marines at Peleliu, who run head-on into 4 replica Mitsubishi Hago Type 95 Japanese tanks, painted correctly in period colors. These are good replicas, and one of them can actually be seen at the National Museum of Singapore. The Marines attempt to combat the tanks using mortars and an M1A1 bazooka, often called a stovepipe. In Europe, these stovepipes often struggled against German armor, but in the Pacific theater performed well against Japanese tanks. Even mortars could knock out a Type 95, exploiting their partial riveted construction, making them vulnerable to explosives. The engine block armor on a Type 95 was so thin that even machine gun fire could penetrate it. However, the Marines are not alone in this scene, and we get our first and only tank-on-tank engagement. And unfortunately it's a brief one, but it's a real M4 Sherman knocking out a Ha-Go. The M4 Sherman is used frequently in the Pacific miniseries, at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and the Battle of Okinawa. Because of the nature of jungle warfare and its difficult terrain, which was not suitable to tanks. The Americans only dedicated a small fraction of their Shermans to the Pacific. In reality, the Americans needed few Shermans, as the Japanese had little to combat it with. American tank crews are more frequently afraid of being swarmed by Japanese infantry than coming across outdated light tanks such as the Ha-Go. Shermans were often best used in the Pacific, such as the Battle of Peleliu, by clearing bunkers. Here's a Sherman doing just that. It would have been great if the studio could have shown just how effective Shermans were at clearing bunkers in the Pacific, using flamethrowers, which they often were equipped with just for this task. Sherman flamethrower tanks were often called Ronson or Zippo tanks.
Hold on, Bill.
To counter the Sherman, the Japanese developed Type 3 Chi-Nu and heavier Type 4 Chi-To. Both tanks are armed with 75mm guns, albeit of a different type. Only 166 Type 3s and 2 Type 4s were built, and none saw combat. They were saved for the defense of the Japanese home islands. Anti-tank mines remained a large fear for Shermans in the Pacific, and this scene, where John Basilone attempts to single-handedly guide a Sherman off the beach at Iwo Jima, is true to history,
You tell that tank to follow me!
and also our last tank scene in the miniseries.
How about if an engine catches fire and you dump in the Pacific?
As a bonus, here is one scene featuring a real airworthy Douglas DC-3, which was imported from Australia for the filming, ready, of course, to take Medal of Honor winner John Basilone back to the United States to do a war bonds tour. That little guy here is a Clarkter 6 airport tug of the era, and just goes to show the excellent detail that went into making this series. Though the war in the Pacific was not a tank war like in Africa or Europe, armored vehicles got Marines to shore and further gave them confidence once they were on land. Tanks, particularly flame tanks, helped clear the complex and formidable Japanese bunker systems. HBO's The Pacific did a good job at paying homage to the armored vehicle crews who served in the Pacific Theater. Alright, I'm Johnny. Thanks for watching this breakdown on the armored vehicles featured in the Pacific. I'm not a historian or tank expert, just a movie fan, so if you want to add to or criticize anything I've said, feel free to do so in the comment section. Also, if you want to support the channel, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.